Welcome to Second Year Code. In this module, we're going to be looking at three different sections of our code book. Within this module, we do have three different objectives. First, we're going to look at the regulations for electrical installations with pools, tubs, and different types of spas. And then we're going to look at the regulations for our services and distribution equipment for both RV parks and mobile home parks. And lastly, we're going to look at the rules behind doing temporary services for construction sites. The first video in this series is all about Section 68 and our electrical requirements around pools, tubs, and spas. Now, if you think about the last time you went to a pool, think about all the electrical equipment as well as all the metal equipment that you saw associated with the pool or with the water. Then you can become aware of the scope of the dangers surrounding electrical equipment and pools. Section 68 deals with both electrical and non-electrical equipment around pools, tubs, and spas. So the first thing we want to do is look at Rule 68000, which gives us an idea of what kind of installations we're talking about within this code section. Also make sure you pay attention to Rule 68050, which is going to give us some definitions of some of the terminology we are going to use within this part. If we can think about some of the things that are inside a pool, we also have to think about the dangers surrounding the pool. And we have to think about things such as not only the electrical equipment that is associated with the pool, such as our lighting and our pumps, but also other electrical equipment like our overhead wires and also underground wires. When it comes to our overhead wires, we have to be aware that there's a number of different things that could be affected by those overhead wires, such as slides and stairs and any other equipment that would protrude into the air. We are not allowed to run electrical wires over top of the pool. The only exceptions that we can have is communication conductors and neutral supported cables as long as they don't exceed 750 volts, but we must maintain at least a 5-meter clearance. If we have any other conductors that are not exceeding 50,000 kilovolts but are above 750 volts, then we need to make sure that we are maintaining a 7.5-meter clearance. Make sure that you are checking Rule 68054 Appendix B to see this diagram so that we are aware of how far away of all of our different types of equipment that we need to be for any type of overhead lines. When it comes to our underground conductors, we could have something called voltage leakage. And we need to be aware of that because if we have a heavily saturated ground like we would have around a pool, then that could make a good conductor for any type of voltage leaking. Since this could pose a danger to the people using the pool, we need to make sure we check Table 61, which has distances that are based on both the voltage and the different types of cables that we have, such as communication conductors must maintain a horizontal separation from a pool wall of at least 1.5 meters, whereas my power conductors for 0 to 750 volts must also have that same range. If I have any more than 750 volts, which is possible in some commercial applications, then I'm going to go up to 3 meters for anything between 751 and 15 kilovolts, and 6 meters between 15 kilovolts and 28 kilovolts. Obviously, one of the best ways that we can protect ourselves and other people is to make sure that we have a good and adequate bonding system in place. So anything within our pool or around our pool, or even the things our pool is made of, must be bonded properly. So think of all the metal things that we have in and around a pool, such as our stairs, our diving boards, our deck lights, and any piping that we might have. All these need to be made sure that they're properly and adequately bonded. Rule 68058 states that all non-electrical equipment within 1.5 meters of the pool must be bonded. That's going to include any framework for my actual pool or even rebar within the concrete. We would also have to consider fences, ladders, slides, railings, and even any buildings that might be close to the pool, because they will have things such as metal downspouts that would have to be taken into consideration. Any of the pool reinforcing steel must be grounded in at least 4 locations that are evenly spaced around the pool, and this will include any reinforcement inside the pool deck itself. If the rebar the concrete installers are using has a non-conductive coating, then we must also install a number 6 copper conductor loop all the way around the pool, and that loop must be below the water level. Any permanent or in-ground pools must be grounded with a minimum of a number 6 copper conductors, and any other pools that we have such as above ground pools, we'll use Table 16. All the bonding conductors must terminate at the panel board that is supplying the pool electrical equipment. If we have a dedicated panel just for a pool area, then we must run all of our bonding conductors back to that panel board. If we're using a panel board inside another section of the building, then once again, that is the panel board we must run all of our bonding back to. Any buildings that are within 1.5 meter of the pool that have any exposed metal like siding or downspouts also must be bonded, and we cannot overlook those. If we have a continuous metal pool made of separate panels, each one of those separate panels need to be securely connected together either with bolts or by welding, and they must be bonded at least one location. Anytime that we have lighting or any other underwater equipment, we need to make sure that we can facilitate a good and proper connection to it. We will use a special type of junction box called a deck box, which is covered in Rule 68060. Deck boxes are to be used to supply any wiring to the underground luminaires, so they must be specific boxes connected to the forming shells for the lights, which must be watertight. An important part of this is that they must have a provision for 3 bonding conductors inside the box, as well as 1 lug on the outside of the box that will fit a number 6 copper conductor. Remember, we will have a grounding grid around the pool in order to facilitate any currents that might be around. So we want to be able to connect our deck boxes to that grounding grid as well. It's important that these deck boxes only contain the conductors that are supplying the underground equipment. And we must make sure that there's continuous bonding between the junction boxes and all the other metal components. Any raceways that come between the lighting forming shell inside the pool wall and the deck box needs to be sealed to prevent any water from getting into the box. And the box needs to be located so it isn't an obstacle. So if you're walking along the deck itself, you will not trip and it does not become a hazard. We also make sure that there's a slope away from the deck box so any water will run away from it rather than towards it. When it comes to other electrical equipment such as receptacles, Rule 68064 deals with those. We are not allowed to put any receptacles of any sort between the pool wall and 1.5 meters. If we are outside the 1.5 meters and up to 3 meters away, any receptacles in that area need to be a Class A GFCI protected circuit. We can either use a Class A receptacle or we can use a Class A breaker in order to protect those circuits. If we are beyond 3 meters away from the pool wall, then we are considering them all to be normal standard outlets. Therefore, we'll follow other parts of the code rule. If this is inside a building, for example, we can just have our standard branch circuit. But if the pool is outside, then we would follow the outside rules of having a GFCI for our exterior receptacles. All these receptacles are measured from the shortest path from the receptacle to the pool wall. When it comes to pool lighting, there's 2 different types of lighting that can be used inside the pools. The first type is called a wet niche type luminaire, which is a very common type of lighting to have. Within this type of luminaire, they will have a forming shell that forms part of the pool wall. Inside the forming shell goes the light. We need to be aware that the forming shell itself will get flooded, so therefore the raceway that is leaving it must be sealed so the water cannot escape into other parts of our electrical system. And if our forming shell is made of metal, it needs to be bonded if we have our lighting at more than 30 volts to ground. The deepest we can go with this type of fixture is 600 millimeters unless it's approved for more. And the maximum voltage to ground I can have is 150 volts for this type of wet niche luminaire. Our other type of light is called a dry niche type luminaire. And these are submerged fixtures, but these are actually accessible from a dry walkway or a handhole behind the pool wall. Since these lights are not directly submerged in water, we can increase our maximum voltage to ground to 300 volts. Regardless of the type of lighting that I have, we do have some rules that will affect all the lighting types. If any light, which is either submerged or within 3 meters of pool wall, it must be GFCI protected. The exception to that is if the light is behind a barrier or behind a fence, then the GFCI is not needed, even if that is still within the 3 meters. Any metal parts that are exposed to the water also need to be made of brass, since brass is a corrosion-resistant material. We have a few rules surrounding GFCI protection. The items that would need to be GFCI protected is any electrical equipment in or around the pool, so between that 1.5 and 3 meter distance. If we're dealing with any spas or hot tubs, they would require GFCI protection. Also, any audio amplifiers that are connected to pool loudspeakers or receptacles in wet areas such as locker rooms or change areas. All these GFCIs shall be Class A type or an equivalent, and this is according to Rule 68068. Any GFCI protected circuits, they need to be marked as such, and they need to be tested regularly. Where we install the GFCI receptacles or breakers is any place that's going to be accessible so we can facilitate that testing, and we cannot locate them within 3 meters of pools, hot tubs, or spas. So while our receptacles might be within that 3 meter range, our GFCI itself cannot be. If we're dealing with hydrotherapy tubs, we cannot put any GFCIs within 1.5 meters of those tubs, but they can be closer as long as the occupant of the tub can't reach it, so it's behind a barrier. Those are all the general rules that we have for different types of pool installations. So let's look at some rules that are specific to different types of pools. First, we're going to look at permanently installed pools, which is covered in Rule 68-100. For any permanently installed pools, we need to make sure that we are using a raceway that's either corrosion resistant or PVC whenever we're going from deck boxes into the forming shells. If we are using wet niche luminaires, they must also have an approved flexible cord. Normally this is installed from the manufacturer, but we need to make sure that the manufacturer is matching up with CSA approval. For any of our GFCI protected circuits, we must make sure that we keep the load side of those circuits separate from anything that does not require GFCI. We only want to GFCI protect those things in which the code says we have to. Any of the conduits that are installed inside the decks or the walls of the pools do need to be drained so they don't fill up with water and therefore flood our junction boxes as well. Beyond those rules, Section 12 is going to apply everywhere else. Anytime that we are dealing with storable swimming pools, we're going to look at Rule 68-200, which state that the pumps need to have permanent power, and that permanent power needs to be placed anywhere between 1.5 and 7.5 meters away from the pool. Keeping in mind that if we're within that 1.5 to 3 meter distance, that still needs to be GFCI protected. Any of the pool pumps must be kept 3 meters away from the pool unless otherwise approved. If you've ever had one in your backyard, you'll know that the hoses that connect the pool to the pump are not really that long. Therefore, double check the pump and make sure it is approved to be closer than that 3 meter rule. If you ever need to replace a pump on a pool like this, make sure the pump that you're replacing with is also approved for that location. For hydro massage therapy bathtubs, there's a few rules that we can find in 68-306, and that states that each cord shall be connected to a receptacle that is A, supplied by a dedicated brand circuit for all the receptacles inside this rule, B, not less than 300 millimeters from the floor, and C, not accessible to the tub occupant. The reason we want to have a dedicated brand circuit is to make sure that this tub is protected properly without any interference from any other devices. Also, keeping the receptacle 300 millimeters off the floor allows for any flooding or splashing that might occur, and that height will try to prevent any interference with the receptacle itself. All the receptacles need to be Class A GFCI protected, and we need to put appropriate warning labels on the receptacles so that they are not used for anything but the bathtub equipment. Remember, these are dedicated circuits for a reason. When we're looking at hot tubs, we have to break them into two categories. We have the hot tub that you have at your house, and then we have the hot tub that is available in a commercial location. Either way, they both must be bonded and GFCI protected, and the controls must either be integral, so built into the unit itself, or they have to be at least 1 meter away from the tub. Any receptacles or luminaires will fall under other rules found within this section. Any hot tubs that are found outside dwelling units, so in a commercial environment, need to have an emergency shutoff switch. That switch needs to make sure that it disconnects all the power. It must be independent of the tub controls, so it cannot be a timer switch. It must be located within sight and 15 meters of the tub, and it has to be properly labeled. It also must activate visual and audible warnings when it's actuated, so it's a good idea to put on the label that it will do that. That way we can eliminate some nuisance tripping from people who just feel like pushing a big red button. If our spa or our hot tub is field assembled, we have to look at Rule 68-406, which talks about leakage current collectors. The job of a leakage current collector is to catch any residual electrical fields that might be found inside the water and give them a reasonable path to ground. This only applies to systems if the pump motor is not indicated as an insulated wet end pump. Where we place the leakage current collectors are in each water inlet and outlet, so they have access to the water that comes in and leaves the tub. They need to be made of corrosion-resistant metal, and they must be electrically isolated from the tub so their only contact is with the water. We have to make sure that we bond it back to the control panel or the main service ground, and we can use Table 16 to size it based on the size of the circuit feeding the tub, but it cannot be any smaller than a number 6 gauge copper conductor. If we're dealing with any field assembled units, we can only use the approved parts, and they must be installed according to other rules within this section. If we're dealing with air blowers, they're not meant to get wet, so they need to be protected from the water contact. And we do this either by locating it in a place where it won't get wet, or some other means such as guarding. Make sure you're looking through Appendix B on 68-406 for other information with this rule. We're now at the end of Part 1 for 205H. We've looked at the different regulations for installing electrical around and over our pools and tubs. And also we looked at individual rules that are specific to each different type of installation. Make sure you're reading through this section and you understand the rules, and when you're ready, you can move on to the next video.